Hi, welcome to the bathtub, where when you hear this sound, and you see this rinky-dink statue, you know it's time for another episode of the highly regarded, internationally renowned All-Bathtub Hall of Fame. That is for the greatest writers, the number one writers of all time, and the ones who have filled the most bathtubs. That's all. We don't really look for anything. They haven't changed the world. They haven't done anything except entertained a lot of people in bathtubs, and that they've actually possibly filled up as many bathtubs as the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean as put together. This week it's brought to you by a new sponsor. We have a new sponsor at the bathtub. It's called ACMA. I don't know where they came up with it. It's a beautiful sounding acronym. It's like MILF or SMERSH or something like that. And it's Amazon and the Washington Post can kiss my ass. That's the name of this quasi-religious, deeply fanatical organization. I've never met any representatives of this organization, but they only stand for one thing, and that is that all of us imperfect people who buy crap from idiots and horrible people who are just destroying our planet, the Bezos-like creatures of the world, that we're going to try to buy books and news from people who don't treat their employees like shit, particularly their part-time employees. There's Lucky. This is my only part-time employee in the bathtub who we treat like shit. That's the only person, and I'm going to make her get down in a minute. So I'm starting the ball rolling by putting up some names like theintercept.com. I'm sending them my money instead of the Washington Post. Bookshop.org. I'm going to put all these up on I've got a little web page for people connected to this. And Skylight Books, that's my personal choice for a local bookstore. But I'm going to ask people to suggest, if you've got really good local bookshops or good news sources that aren't the Washington Post, you can put them in the notes, the comment sections for these pointless discussions. Okay, so we'll try to just toss out some ideas to each other and try to help each other. Lucky is going to drive me crazy already. As you see, as soon as we start talking, she gets in here. I've got a glass of wine, and we're going to try to keep this really short and brief because these awards are very prestigious. We really want to just let the dead writer know that they won it. We'll try to give it to living writers, but to dead writers, so they just go off and celebrate. Lucky, you're going to have to get down, please. Okay, so the first premise was my plan is to do 3 episodes on the great Ray Bradbury. You cannot have an all-bathtub Hall of Fame without fucking Ray Bradbury. Excuse my language again. I'm really sorry about this. But I do love Ray Bradbury. I grew up reading Ray Bradbury. I'm going to talk as briefly as I can about my love for him and try to do 3 of these. There's a really excellent series of biographies, one of which I was going to review for a newspaper I don't even want to think about again, and that is this series by Eller. Jonathan Eller. They're coming from the University of Illinois Press. There's 3 volumes, which you only do for people like Hemingway or for George Bernard Shaw and stuff like this. And they've done this 3-volume on Bradbury's life, and I think he deserves it. It's a very good series. I just read the first volume. I thought we'd talk about the early Bradbury career as quickly as we can, and this covers that period. There's a number of things about the book that I enjoyed. One of the things about biographies of great writers, if you're not a writer, I don't know why people read biographies of writers, because most of them are really boring. They live really boring lives. Occasionally you'll see someone like Orwell who fights in the Spanish-American War or something. But most writers he sits around at the house, he lives in his parents' garage for many years, he reads lots of books, and he hangs out with writers, and he loves writing, and he just goes off with writers. That's all it's about. So it's about a lot of his friends and the people he corresponded with. And it's a little bit about the way he wrote stories, which he just wrote lots of work. He was one of those people who did say he writes every day. I remember him once saying you should write a short story a week. But he didn't even finish it, because clearly from this book he revised stories almost his entire life, and even late in life was publishing stories that he'd started when he was a young man. Another thing I like about Bradbury is he's a real Californian. He's born in Waukegan, Illinois, and I sometimes had it I think I'm wrong about this, though. I used to think he kind of over-sentimentalized the Midwest and his childhood then. and things like Dandelion Wine and books that I didn't quite take to when I was young. But he has a pretty dark vision of Americans almost throughout his work. So maybe that's unfair. But anyway, he moved to California. He was a pretty young man. He lived in California his whole life. And he knew California and Southern California well. And he traveled up and down the coast. And he knew Mexico. He traveled through Mexico quite a bit. And he sort of writes really well about California. As a fellow Californian, I love Bradbury as well as just liking his work. Some of the writers that influenced him. So I want to talk about a couple of writers who, it's clear from this book, were big influences on Bradbury. The two that come to mind immediately are Hemingway. In terms of Bradbury's kind of the first writer that I can think of who takes genre fiction. So when science fiction was coming out of the pulps, we talked a lot about Astounding and Jack Williamson and John Campbell and Isaac Asimov and that kind of gosh wow science fiction stuff that was in the pulps. And he wrote for those pulps, and he loved that work, but he also loved literary fiction. He's kind of the first writer who kind of not only fuses them in almost every story, but writes across genres. So he writes mystery stories, he writes literary short stories, he writes fantasy, science fiction stories. He writes a wide palette of generic interests. And Hemingway is clearly stylistically the one who I see the most in him. There's a lot of Hemingway in his work, a lot of the way he thinks of sentences. And the other one I can't help but think about is Sherwood Anderson. And he did like Winesburg, Ohio. It was kind of hard not to imagine a Bradbury career if he hadn't read Winesburg, Ohio. And that kind of weirdness of middle American life and the kind of weird flights of oddness that you can just stumble across just walking through town in a little place, in any little place in America. That there's something kind of pleasant about it and something disturbing about it at the same time, and that's in all of his work. On the science fiction side, some of his big buddies when he was young is he went off and met a lot of older writers who helped him a lot, and he really listened to the older writers. The great Lee Brackett, I picked one of her detective stories. She wrote a wide variety. She was also a terrific screenwriter, and we're going to definitely do some episodes on Lee Brackett. I think she's one of the great unsung California writers. Jack Williamson we mentioned, real strange, very literate, bizarre flights of imagination science fiction that still hold up. I think most of these books still hold up, and they're still a lot of fun. So those were big influences on some of the big influences. Edmund Hamilton was another one, but Bradbury read a lot. Finally, I just want to talk a little bit about some of his early books and his early reception. So I guess he wrote a lot of stories, for a lot of different magazines. He became pretty well regarded as a short story writer, and published from not just science fiction and the pulp magazines, but in a lot of the slick magazines, particularly some of the women's magazines that published good literary stories, like Collier's and Red Book and places like that. One of the great places for the short story with a lot of the women's slick magazines. They published some of the great short story writers in the 50s. Much more so than the New Yorker, in my opinion. I can't remember which is his first book, The Martian Chronicles. As I've talked about this, briefly. I read this. One of the first books I ever read that was not a kid's book was Something Wicked This Way Comes. I was 14 years old. I couldn't put it down. I loved it. I ran off, and the next book I got was The Martian Chronicles. I just still have memories of this book. It's not just going off into another planet, but it's looking at American life and American life transported to this place where basically we do all the horrible things we did in our own country of America to another race of people, and then try to find ourselves in this mess that we create. It's a really beautiful and dark and really disturbing, ultimately disturbing book. One of the last stories is called There Will Come Soft Rains. And Bradbury did not have a lot of hope for the human race. He was pretty much a skeptical person in many ways. And I think some of that gets lost in kind of his big... He acts like kind of almost eternal child in his old age, which I still think is... He was still a very smart and intelligent man, but he kind of was... I kind of started to lose interest a little bit in him as he got older. He just seemed too ebullient in a way. But his central core premise about human life is it was going to do horrible things. And There Will Come Soft Rains is about the end of Earth and these automated homes going on and on. Another great early short story collections. Again, these were early stories that he kind of sewed together with a kind of gimmick, which was the Illustrated Man. Look at that great cover. I'm telling you, those are the great. This is the best cover the book ever had, and just amazing stories. The Golden Apples of the Sun. And these were his first three books. And then his first book was something called Dark Carnival, because he started off as a horror writer. He started getting some of his early success and had his first book published by Arkham House, the same people who published Lovecraft, of all people. And very different writer from Lovecraft, but Arkham House published two or three of the most important American writers of the 40s and 50s, Clark Ashton Smith, Lovecraft, and Bradbury, earlier than that. Anyway, this is the October Country, the book that I read this week to kind of catch up with to reread Bradbury. I haven't read him in quite a long time. I used him in class a few years ago, and was pleased to find that his stuff still holds up. It's technically beautifully written. Really a sharp writer, sentence by sentence, knows what he's doing and knows how to tell a story. And he still surprises you. Here's another great. Again, this is great old cover from Ballantine, the October Country, and this has these terrific illustrations by a guy whose name I can never pronounce. Joe Mugnini. I'm sorry. There's one of them. You get a lot of these kind of ink drawings. They're just wonderful drawings. And one of the most famous early stories of Bradbury was The Homecoming, which is kind of a Charles Addams-like Addams Family type series of stories. He has 3 or 4 of them that I know of. Another one is in here called Uncle Einar, which is a terrific story. And The Homecoming is basically about a kid who's normal, who's part of a family of kind of fantastic creatures, werewolves and men with wings and vampires, and they all it's almost like a Munsters episode, but written by Truman Capote. I'll read just a brief passage and then shut up. This is when he's the kid. They have a family reunion every 10 or 20 years or so. And at midnight, the young boy is excited. All these people, all his relatives are coming to visit. At midnight, a storm hammered the house. Lightning struck outside in amazing snow-white bolts. There was a sound of an approaching, probing, sucking tornado, funneling and nuzzling the moist night earth. Then the front door, blasted half off its hinges, hung stiff and discarded, and in trooped Grandmama and Grandpapa, all the way from the old country. From then on, people arrived each hour. There was a flutter at the side window, a rap on the front porch, a knock at the back. There were fey noises from the cellar. Autumn wind piped down the chimney throat, chanting. Mother filled the large crystal punch bowl with the scarlet fluid, poured from the jugs Bion had carried home. Father swept from room to room, lighting more tapers. Laura and Ellen hammered up more wolfsbane, and Timothy stood amidst this wild excitement. No expression on his face, his hands trembling at his sides, gazing now here, now there, banging of doors, laughter, the sound of liquid pouring, darkness, sound of wind, the webbed thunder of wings, the padding of feet, the welcoming bursts of talk at the entrances, the transparent rattlings of casements, the shadows passing, coming, going, wavering. I love every passage is really quite good in this book. I'm just going to one of the things that was interesting about Bradbury, and we'll kind of pursue when we go on through the biographies. There's 2 more volumes. It was mid-career and his late career. Is he was one of the few writers who started published in the pulps. I mean, Lovecraft never received this, and Clark Ashton Smith never received this attention outside of the genre. That Bradbury actually got read by who were considered literary people. So Christopher Isherwood was one of his big fans. Truman Capote really supported Bradbury's work, and you can see a lot of similarities between Truman Capote's early stories, particularly in Bradbury's work. And in England, a lot of there were a lot of literary writers who weren't ashamed. Again, in America, it's a bit. I can't imagine Norman Mailer saying he'd read a science fiction book. I mean, Norman Mailer was an idiot, but at the same time, I can't imagine most of that generation saying, "Oh yeah, I really like Ray Bradbury." You really do see it in England. So the likes of Kingsley Amis, there's his great early book on science fiction. It's still a good read. New Maps of Hell. And again, who are willing to look at some of this work coming out of the pulp side of publishing and see something in it that wasn't just derided by literary know-it-alls. Okay, a great lifetime work by Ray Bradbury. Ray and your whole family, you can cherish this for the rest of eternity. And I'll be posting some links to places we can buy our stuff that isn't from people who treat their part-time employees like rubbish, especially in pandemics, and cut off their health insurance and do whatever the hell they can so they can put more money in their pockets. That's our new sponsor. That's not me. That's a new sponsor, Akma. Lovely name. And we'll talk to you all soon. Happy bathing. Stay safe. Hang on for the next 3 months of politics, 4 months of politics. It's gonna be a fucking mess. We'll hold on and take a bath every day. Okay.